The morning sun cast long shadows across the spaceport tarmac as Marcus wiped grease from his hands with an old rag. 20 years of fixing starships had taught him that every vessel had its own personality, but the sleek Zephyrian cruiser sitting in Base 7 was unlike anything he'd encountered. Its hull shimmered with an otherworldly iridescence that seemed to shift colors when he wasn't looking directly at it. Captain Veltar, a towering reptilian being with scales that caught the light like polished emeralds, approached with obvious distress etched across his elongated features. The Zephyrians were an ancient race, known throughout the galaxy for their wisdom and their sacred bond with creatures humans had only heard about in legends, dragons. Human Marcus, Veltar's voice carried a tremor that made the mechanic look up from his diagnostic tablet. "I must speak with you about a matter of grave importance." Marcus had worked on Zephyrian ships before, but he'd never seen one of their captains look so shaken. The usually composed beings prided themselves on their emotional control, yet Veltar's hands visibly trembled as he clasped them behind his back. "What's troubling you, Captain?" Marcus set down his tools and gave the alien his full attention. Despite the language barriers that sometimes arose between species, he'd learned that genuine concern transcended words. Veltar's large, amber eyes darted around the bay before settling on Marcus. 3 days ago, during our journey from the Andorian system, something unprecedented occurred. Our sacred cargo, 12 dragon hatchlings, vanished from their secure chamber. The words hit Marcus like a plasma bolt to the chest. Dragons were more than just creatures to the Zephyrians, they were living symbols of their civilization, partners in a bond that stretched back millions of years. The loss of even one hatchling would be considered a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Vanished? Marcus leaned against his workbench, trying to process what he'd just heard. How does something like that happen on a ship? The captain's scales darkened to a deeper shade of green, a sign of distress that Marcus had learned to recognize during his years working with various alien species. The chamber was sealed with our most advanced security systems. No breach was detected, no alarms triggered. When we checked on them for their morning feeding, the chamber was empty except for the nesting materials. Marcus rubbed his stubbled jaw thoughtfully. In his experience, when something seemed impossible, there was usually a logical explanation hiding just beneath the surface. Have you searched the entire ship? Hatchlings might be small enough to squeeze through ventilation systems or maintenance passages. We have conducted 3 complete searches, Veltar replied, his voice heavy with despair. Every chamber, every conduit, every possible hiding place has been examined. Our ship's internal sensors show no life signs matching dragon physiology anywhere aboard the vessel. The implications of what the captain was describing sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Dragon theft was not just a crime in Zephyrian society, it was an act that could trigger interstellar conflicts. The political ramifications alone could destabilize entire sectors of the galaxy. "Captain, with your permission, I'd like to take a look at your ship's systems," Marcus offered. Sometimes fresh eyes can spot things that others might miss, especially if those eyes belong to someone who's spent 2 decades troubleshooting impossible problems. Veltar's expression brightened slightly, the first sign of hope Marcus had seen since their conversation began. "You would do this? Even though you are not of our people?" "Those hatchlings are living beings," Marcus replied simply. "That makes it my business." As they walked toward the Zephyrian vessel, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this case was going to challenge everything he thought he knew about both technology and the universe itself. The ship's entrance dilated as they approached, revealing an interior that was as beautiful as it was alien. The corridors were wider than those found on human ships, with walls that seemed to pulse with a gentle, organic rhythm. Bioluminescent panels provided soft, warm lighting that felt more like natural sunlight than artificial illumination. Everything about the ship spoke of a civilization that had learned to blend technology with the natural world in ways humans were only beginning to understand. "The hatchling chamber is located in the ship's heart," Veltar explained as they walked through passages lined with what appeared to be living crystal formations. "It is the most secure and protected area of any Zephyrian vessel." They passed several crew members along the way, each one bowing their heads respectfully to their captain while casting curious glances at the human mechanic. Marcus could sense their desperation, the weight of responsibility that pressed down on everyone aboard the ship. The loss of the hatchlings wasn't just a professional failure, it was a spiritual crisis. The chamber door itself was a work of art, carved from a single piece of what looked like crystallized dragon scale. It stood nearly 3 meters tall and was covered in intricate symbols that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally. As Veltar placed his hand on a bioscanner, the door sang a melodious note and began to split down the middle, revealing the chamber within. Marcus stepped inside and immediately understood why the Zephyrians considered this space sacred. The chamber was circular, with walls that curved upward to form a dome overhead. The surfaces were lined with the same living crystal he'd seen in the corridors, but here they pulsed with a warmer, more nurturing light. 12 small alcoves were carved into the walls at regular intervals, each one lined with materials that looked soft enough to cradle the most delicate of creatures. The nesting materials are undisturbed, Veltar noted, gesturing toward the alcoves. Whatever happened, it occurred without any struggle or disturbance to their environment. Marcus knelt beside one of the alcoves, running his fingers over the nesting material. It felt like a cross between silk and down, impossibly soft and warm to the touch. He could detect a faint scent that was both familiar and alien, something that reminded him of summer storms and growing things. "Captain, tell me about the hatchlings themselves," Marcus said as he examined the chamber's environmental controls. "How old were they? What were their capabilities?" "They had emerged from their eggs only days before our departure," Veltar replied. "At that age, they are no larger than your hand and possess limited mobility. Their greatest ability at such a young stage is their empathic connection. They can sense and respond to the emotions of those around them." An idea began to form in Marcus's mind as he studied the chamber's life support systems. The environmental controls showed perfect stability, temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition had remained constant throughout the journey. But there was something else, something in the energy readings that didn't quite match what he would expect from an empty chamber. "Captain, I need to run some specialized scans," Marcus said, pulling out his portable diagnostic equipment. "These readings are showing energy patterns that don't match an unoccupied space." As Marcus began his scans, the results painted an even more puzzling picture. The chamber was indeed empty of any large life forms, but there were trace energy signatures that suggested something had been present recently. More intriguingly, the energy patterns were unlike anything in his extensive database of known species. "This is unprecedented," Marcus muttered as he studied the readouts. "These energy signatures don't match any known dragon physiology, but they're definitely biological in nature." Veltar leaned over his shoulder, studying the incomprehensible human technology with obvious fascination. "What does this mean?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Marcus admitted. "But I have a theory that's either brilliant or completely insane. What if the hatchlings didn't disappear in the conventional sense? What if something happened to them that changed their fundamental nature?" The captain's scale shifted to a lighter shade of green, indicating confusion. "I do not understand. How can one's fundamental nature change?" Marcus stood up and began pacing around the chamber, his mind racing through possibilities that seemed to border on the impossible. In human mythology, dragons are often depicted as creatures of transformation. What if that's not just mythology? What if, under certain circumstances, dragon hatchlings can undergo some kind of metamorphosis that makes them undetectable by conventional means? "You speak of legends," Veltar said slowly. "But our ancient texts do mention the possibility of dragons achieving states of existence beyond physical form. It was thought to be an ability reserved only for the eldest and wisest of their kind. But what if extreme stress or fear could trigger something similar in hatchlings?" Marcus proposed. "Think about it, they're on a ship traveling through space, away from their home world, when something happens that frightens them beyond measure. Could that trigger some kind of protective transformation?" The captain was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what Marcus was suggesting. If such a thing were possible, it would explain why our sensors cannot detect them. But how would we reverse such a transformation? How would we call them back? Marcus looked around the chamber again, this time with new eyes. If his theory was correct, the hatchlings might still be here, existing in a state that was beyond the ability of current technology to detect. But if they were still present, there might be a way to reach them. Captain, you mentioned that dragon hatchlings have empathic abilities, Marcus said, turning to face Veltar. What if we tried to communicate with them emotionally rather than through conventional means? You suggest we attempt to project feelings of safety and welcome? Veltar's voice carried a note of hope. It is possible, though such communication typically requires a pre-existing bond between dragon and Zephyrian. But, I'm not Zephyrian, Marcus pointed out. Maybe that's exactly what we need, someone who can approach this without preconceptions about how things should work. As they stood in the chamber, discussing possibilities that seemed to stretch the boundaries of known science, neither of them noticed the faint shimmer that passed through the air near one of the alcoves. It was barely visible, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, but, for just a moment something seemed to respond to their presence. The search for the missing dragon hatchlings was about to take a turn that would challenge everything both species thought they knew about the nature of life, consciousness, and the bonds that connected all living things across the vast expanse of space. Marcus spent the next several hours running every diagnostic test he could think of, while Veltar provided insights into Zephyrian technology that no human had ever been privileged to learn. The collaboration between the two species was unprecedented, born out of necessity but growing into something that might have lasting implications for interstellar relations. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself increasingly convinced that his theory was correct. The hatchlings were still in the chamber, existing in a state that transcended normal physical detection. The question was no longer where they were, but how to bring them back to a state where they could be seen, heard, and cared for once again. The answer, when it came, would require both species to expand their understanding of what was possible and to trust in connections that went deeper than technology or conventional wisdom could explain. The next morning brought no conventional breakthrough, but Marcus had spent the entire night researching everything he could find about dragon behavior, Zephyrian bonding rituals, and the intersection of emotion and energy in various galactic species. His small apartment near the spaceport was now cluttered with data tablets, holographic displays, and empty coffee cups, the detritus of an obsessive search for answers. When he returned to the Zephyrian ship, he found Veltar and several crew members gathered in the chamber, their heads bowed in what appeared to be a form of meditation or prayer. The captain looked up as Marcus approached, and the human could see that the night had been just as difficult for the alien crew. "Any changes?" Marcus asked quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever ritual they were performing. "None that our instruments can detect," Veltar replied with obvious frustration. "But some of the crew believe they can sense a presence, something just beyond the edge of perception." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. During his research, he had come across several references to empathic species who could detect emotional resonances that lay outside the normal spectrum of technological sensors. If the Zephyrians were experiencing something their instruments couldn't measure, it might be exactly the breakthrough they needed. "Captain, I have an idea, but it's going to require trust between our species unlike anything that's been attempted before," Marcus said, setting down his equipment. "What if we tried to create a bridge between human intuition and Zephyrian empathic ability?" The concept was unprecedented. While both species had worked together on various projects over the decades, the kind of deep emotional connection Marcus was proposing had never been attempted. It would require both sides to lower barriers that had existed for as long as the two civilizations had known each other. Veltar considered the proposal for several long moments before nodding slowly. "The hatchlings are worth any risk. What do you propose?" "I want you to try to establish an empathic link with me," Marcus explained. "If I'm right about the hatchlings existing in an altered state, they might be more likely to trust someone who approaches them without the weight of Zephyrian expectations." The process of establishing an empathic link between species was delicate and potentially dangerous. Zephyrian neural patterns operated on frequencies that could be overwhelming to human consciousness, while human emotional patterns could seem chaotic and unpredictable to Zephyrian minds. But, if it worked, it could create a communication channel that transcended normal limitations. Veltar called for privacy, and the other crew members reluctantly left the chamber. The captain then began preparing for a procedure that no Zephyrian had ever attempted with a human. He produced a small crystalline device from his robes, explaining that it would help regulate the neural interface and prevent damage to either of their minds. "Place your hand here," Veltar instructed, indicating a section of the chamber wall that seemed to pulse with gentle energy. I will attempt to synchronize my empathic field with your neural patterns. Marcus pressed his palm against the warm crystal surface and immediately felt a tingling sensation that seemed to spread up his arm and into his chest. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. As Veltar placed his own hand on an adjacent section of the wall, the tingling intensified and began to take on qualities that Marcus couldn't quite describe. Suddenly, he was experiencing the chamber through Zephyrian senses. The empathic resonance that Veltar had described was now tangible, a warm presence that seemed to hover just at the edge of perception. But, more than that, Marcus could feel the captain's deep love and concern for the missing hatchlings, emotions so pure and powerful that they brought tears to the human's eyes. Can you sense them? Veltar's voice seemed to come from both outside and inside Marcus's mind simultaneously. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to extend his consciousness into the space around them. Through the empathic link, he could perceive layers of reality that his normal senses had never detected. The chamber wasn't empty, it was filled with presence, with life, with consciousness that existed just beyond normal perception. "They're here," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "They're all here, but they're afraid. Terrified, actually." Through the link, Marcus could sense the hatchlings' emotional state with startling clarity. They had indeed undergone some kind of transformation in response to extreme fear, but the terror that had triggered their disappearance was still with them, keeping them locked in their altered state. "What are they afraid of?" Veltar asked, his mental voice tinged with confusion. Marcus probed deeper into the empathic resonance, trying to understand the source of the hatchling's fear. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The terror wasn't random or unfocused, it was directed at something specific, something that the innocent creatures perceived as a mortal threat. They're afraid of their own destiny, Marcus realized with growing horror. They can sense what they're meant to become, and it terrifies them. The revelation struck both Marcus and Veltar like a physical blow. Through their empathic connection, they could feel the hatchlings' perspective on their future. These tiny creatures, barely days old, were somehow aware that they were destined to become magnificent but potentially destructive beings. The weight of that knowledge, the burden of their genetic heritage, had overwhelmed their developing minds. "But dragons are noble creatures," Veltar protested through the mental link. "They are symbols of wisdom and protection." "Not to them," Marcus replied, his consciousness still intertwined with the hatchling's emotional state. "They can sense the potential for destruction that lies within their nature. They know that dragons, despite their nobility, possess the power to devastate worlds. That knowledge is too much for minds so young and innocent." The empathic link allowed both Marcus and Veltar to experience the hatchling's terror firsthand. Through their innocent perception, the future looked like an endless series of difficult choices between protection and destruction, wisdom and power, love and the terrible responsibility that came with their draconic heritage. "How do we help them?" Veltar asked, his mental voice heavy with sorrow for the suffering of creatures he had sworn to protect. Marcus pondered the question while maintaining his connection to the hatchling's emotional state. The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and profound. The young dragons didn't need to be convinced that their fears were unfounded, they needed to understand that they weren't alone in facing those fears. "We show them that others have faced similar choices and found ways to use their power for good," Marcus suggested. "We share our own experiences with responsibility and the weight of capability." Through the empathic link, Marcus began to project his own memories and experiences. He shared moments from his life when he had been forced to make difficult decisions, times when his knowledge and skills had given him the power to help or harm others. He showed them his own struggles with responsibility and the ways he had learned to carry that burden without being crushed by it. Veltar, understanding the approach, began sharing his own experiences and those of his people. Through the captain's memories, the hatchlings could see how generations of Zephyrians had partnered with dragons, how they had learned to guide and support their magnificent companions through the challenges of wielding great power. The response was immediate and profound. Through the empathic link, Marcus could feel the hatchlings' terror beginning to diminish as they realized they wouldn't have to face their fears alone. The knowledge that others had walked similar paths and found ways to use their capabilities for protection rather than destruction began to ease their overwhelming anxiety. Slowly, gradually, the chamber began to shimmer with visible energy patterns. What had been invisible to both normal senses and technological sensors began to manifest as faint, translucent forms scattered throughout the alcoves. The hatchlings were returning to normal spacetime, drawn back by the comfort of knowing they wouldn't face their destiny in isolation. The first to fully materialize was a small creature no larger than Marcus's hand, with scales that shifted between silver and gold in the chamber's gentle light. Its large, luminous eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression of gratitude and trust that spoke volumes about the connection they had established. One by one, the other hatchlings followed, their forms solidifying as their fear continued to diminish. Each one was unique, with scale patterns and coloring that reflected their individual personalities. Some appeared more confident than others, but all of them carried themselves with a new sense of purpose and hope. Magnificent, Veltar breathed, his voice filled with joy as he watched his precious charges return to the physical world. I have never seen anything like this transformation. Marcus carefully broke the empathic link, though he could still feel an echo of the connection they had forged. The experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He had touched minds that existed on a level of awareness beyond human experience, and the memory of that contact would remain with him forever. They're still afraid, he observed, watching as the hatchlings huddled together in their alcoves. But now it's a manageable fear, something they can grow with rather than be overwhelmed by. The captain approached the nearest alcove, extending his hand toward one of the newly materialized hatchlings. The small dragon sniffed delicately at his fingers before allowing itself to be gently lifted from its nesting material. Its tiny claws gripped Veltar's scaled hand with obvious trust, and the captain's expression became one of pure joy. The bond is stronger now, Veltar observed with wonder. Somehow, their experience has deepened their capacity for connection. Marcus nodded, understanding what the captain meant. The hatchlings' journey through their transformed state had forced them to develop new levels of awareness and empathy. They had emerged not just as young dragons, but as beings with an enhanced ability to understand and connect with the emotions of others. As the day progressed, Marcus and Veltar worked together to help the hatchlings readjust to normal existence. The young dragons seemed to have an insatiable curiosity about the human who had helped guide them back, clustering around Marcus whenever he approached their alcoves and chirping in melodic tones that sounded almost like questions. They want to know more about you, Veltar translated, his ability to communicate with the hatchlings apparently enhanced by their shared experience. They have never encountered a human before, and your presence during their transformation has created a bond they don't fully understand. The implications of what had happened were staggering. Not only had they successfully retrieved the missing hatchlings, but they had forged a connection between species that might have lasting consequences for interstellar relations. The young dragons now carried within their consciousness the memory of human compassion and understanding, knowledge that would influence their entire development. As evening approached and the hatchlings settled into a peaceful sleep in their alcoves, Marcus prepared to return to his quarters. The events of the past 2 days had exhausted him in ways he had never experienced, but they had also filled him with a sense of accomplishment unlike any he had known in his years as a mechanic. But the most significant changes were yet to come. The empathic bond he had formed with both the captain and the hatchlings had created connections that would prove impossible to sever, relationships that would transform his understanding of his place in the galaxy and his role in the greater tapestry of interstellar civilization. 3 weeks had passed since the hatchlings' return, and Marcus had expected life to resume its normal rhythm of routine maintenance and repair work. Instead, he found himself dealing with something unprecedented in the history of human-alien relations. The dragon hatchlings had formed an attachment to him that defied every known pattern of dragon bonding behavior. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came when Veltar's ship remained in port far longer than any diplomatic or trade mission would require. The captain had filed multiple extension requests with the Spaceport Authority, each time citing ongoing technical consultations as the reason for the delay. In reality, the hatchlings had become increasingly distressed whenever separation from Marcus was attempted. "This is most unusual," Veltar confided to Marcus as they stood in the chamber watching the young dragons play among their alcoves. "In all our recorded history, dragons have only bonded with Zephyrians. The connection you have formed with them challenges everything we thought we understood about their nature." Marcus watched as one of the smaller hatchlings, distinguished by scales that shifted from deep blue to violet, attempted to climb up his pant leg using tiny claws that tickled more than they hurt. The creature's large eyes fixed on his face with an expression of such complete trust that it made his chest tighten with emotion. Maybe that's because no one has ever approached them during a crisis without expectations, Marcus suggested, gently lifting the small dragon to his shoulder where it immediately curled up against his neck with a contented purring sound. I wasn't trying to bond with them, I was just trying to help. The captain nodded thoughtfully, his scales shifting to the golden hue that indicated deep contemplation. Perhaps the purity of your intention created a different kind of connection. Our bonding rituals are ancient and formal, full of ceremony and expectation. What you offered was simple compassion without agenda. Over the past weeks, Marcus had learned more about dragon behavior than any human in history. The hatchlings displayed intelligence far beyond what their size suggested, able to understand complex emotions and respond to subtle changes in mood. They had developed individual relationships with him, each one expressing their attachment in unique ways. The largest of the group, whose scales showed patterns of silver and black, had appointed itself as a guardian of sorts, positioning itself protectively whenever strangers approached. Another, with scales that reminded Marcus of polished copper, had developed a fascination with his tools and would watch intently as he worked on various mechanical projects. "Captain, I've been thinking about our situation," Marcus said as he gently stroked the small dragon on his shoulder. "What if this isn't just an unusual bonding incident? What if this is evolution in action?" Veltar's head tilted in the characteristic Zephyrian expression of intense interest. "Explain your theory." "Your people have been bonded with dragons for millions of years," Marcus began, settling into one of the chamber's bioform chairs while several hatchlings gathered around his feet. That relationship has shaped both species in countless ways. But what if dragons are capable of forming bonds with other species as well? What if their capacity for connection is broader than anyone realized? The implications of what Marcus was suggesting sent ripples of excitement through the chamber. The hatchlings, sensitive to the emotional currents around them, began chirping and moving with increased energy, as if they too understood the significance of the conversation. "If that were true," Veltar said slowly, "it would mean that dragons might be able to serve as bridges between species, facilitating understanding and cooperation on a level never before imagined." As if responding to their discussion, the hatchlings began to demonstrate behaviors that neither Marcus nor Veltar had witnessed before. They moved in coordinated patterns around the chamber, their individual colors blending and shifting in harmonious waves that created an almost hypnotic display of living art. "They're trying to show us something," Marcus realized, watching the intricate dance with growing wonder. "Look at how they move together, it's not random. There's a pattern, a message." Veltar activated his translation systems, running the hatchlings' movements through databases of Zephyrian symbolic communication. The results that appeared on his displays caused his scales to shift rapidly through several colors, indicating extreme surprise and excitement. "Marcus," he said, his voice filled with awe, "they are not just showing us a message. They are creating a new form of communication, one that blends elements of Zephyrian symbolism with patterns I do not recognize but which seem to resonate with human mathematical principles." The dance continued for several more minutes, with each hatchling contributing its own unique movements to the overall pattern. When they finally came to rest, they arranged themselves in a formation that clearly included space for both Veltar and Marcus, as if inviting both beings to join their newly created communication system. "This is unprecedented," Veltar whispered. "They are attempting to create a three-way bond that includes both our species equally." Marcus felt his heart racing as he understood what the hatchlings were proposing. They weren't just attached to him as an individual, they were trying to forge a connection that could serve as a foundation for deeper cooperation between humans and Zephyrians. The young dragons were instinctively working to build bridges between civilizations. "The question is," Marcus said, watching as the hatchlings maintained their formation with obvious patience, "are we ready for what they're offering?" The decision they faced wasn't just personal, it could have implications that rippled throughout the galaxy. If the hatchlings were successful in creating a new form of interspecies bonding, it could revolutionize diplomatic relations and open possibilities for cooperation that had never existed before. Veltar moved to take his position in the formation, his movements careful and reverent. For the future of both our peoples, he said solemnly, we must be ready. Marcus joined them, settling into the space the hatchlings had designated for him. As soon as both beings were in position, the young dragons began to generate a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through the chamber's living crystal walls. The sound was beautiful but also profound, touching something deep within both Marcus and Veltar that transcended their individual consciousness. Through the resonance, Marcus found himself experiencing a level of connection that went far beyond his previous empathic link with Veltar. He could feel not just the captain's emotions, but his thoughts, his memories, his deep love for his people and his hopes for the future. At the same time, he was aware that Veltar was experiencing his own thoughts and feelings with equal clarity. But the most remarkable aspect of the connection was the presence of the hatchlings themselves. Their consciousness was unlike anything either adult being had encountered, pure, unlimited by preconceptions, filled with possibilities that neither species had imagined. Through their innocent perception, Marcus could see potential futures where humans and Zephyrians worked together as partners, where their combined capabilities created solutions to problems that neither could solve alone. The visions that flowed through the connection showed worlds where human ingenuity and Zephyrian wisdom combined to heal damaged ecosystems, where mechanical skill and empathic ability worked together to create technologies that served life rather than merely exploiting it. The hatchlings were showing them not just what was possible, but what was necessary for the continued evolution of galactic civilization. As the harmonic resonance gradually faded, Marcus found himself fundamentally changed by the experience. The connection with the hatchlings and Veltar hadn't been severed, it had been integrated into his consciousness in a way that would influence every decision he made for the rest of his life. The bond is permanent, Veltar said, his voice filled with wonder and a touch of uncertainty. We are now connected in ways that our species have never experienced. The hatchlings clustered around both beings, their contentment evident in the soft purring sounds they made and the gentle colors that rippled across their scales. They had achieved what they set out to do, they had created a bridge between worlds, a living connection that proved intelligence and compassion could transcend the boundaries of species. What happens now? Marcus asked, looking down at the young dragons who had chosen to reshape the future of interstellar relations. Now, Veltar replied, settling into a position that allowed several hatchlings to curl up against his warm scales, we learn what it means to be part of something larger than ourselves. In the days that followed, word of the unprecedented bonding began to spread through both human and Zephyrian communities. Scientists, diplomats, and philosophers from across the galaxy requested permission to study the phenomenon, hoping to understand how such a connection had been formed and whether it could be replicated. But, for Marcus, the significance of what had happened was more personal. He had begun his involvement as a simple mechanic trying to solve a puzzle, but he had ended up becoming a bridge between civilizations. The hatchlings had chosen him not because of any special qualifications or training, but because he had approached them with genuine concern for their well-being. The young dragons themselves continued to grow and develop, but their development was unlike that of any dragons in Zephyrian history. They displayed capabilities that seemed to combine the best aspects of both species. They were bonded with the practical problem-solving skills that humans prized and the empathic wisdom that Zephyrians valued. As Marcus watched them play and learn, he realized that he was witnessing the birth of something entirely new. These hatchlings would grow up to become dragons unlike any that had existed before, beings capable of understanding and connecting with multiple species, living bridges between worlds that had previously remained separate. The chamber that had once been empty except for nesting materials was now filled with the sound of young voices, both draconic and humanoid, as Marcus and Veltar worked together to care for and educate their unusual charges. The partnership between species that the hatchlings had initiated was already bearing fruit in ways neither being had anticipated. When visitors came to observe the phenomenon, they found not just an unusual bonding situation, but a glimpse of what galactic civilization could become when barriers between species were dissolved and replaced with genuine understanding and cooperation. The hatchlings had become symbols of hope for a future where differences between beings were celebrated rather than feared. As Marcus ended each day surrounded by sleeping dragons, their tiny forms warm against his body and their breath creating gentle harmonies in the quiet chamber, he understood that his life had become something far beyond what he had ever imagined possible. He was no longer just a mechanic, he was a partner in an experiment that could reshape the galaxy's approach to interspecies relations. The dragon hatchlings had vanished for weeks, only to be discovered not just on a mechanic's body, but in his heart, his mind, and his future. Their choice to bond with both human and Zephyrian had created possibilities that would influence galactic civilization for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest act of caring for another living being in need.